So in this video I'd like to address an essay that was written by an Australian academic, Paula from Monash University. She's an academic historian who weighed into an interesting debate that erupted in 2014 in Australia, basically revolving around the contest between academic and popular historians. But her source is actually really interesting, can be used in a number of ways. An easy to use source, I think, in a range of different questions for history extension, and just generally raises some interesting questions about history in the 21st century. So basically, remembering that being able to work with a range of these historiographical issues is absolutely fundamental to history extension. So being able to think about who historians are, their biographical details, their context in which they work, what they think the aims and purposes of history are or should be, and how history is constructed over time. I think this source raises a range of interesting questions for some of these particular areas. So firstly, some basic information. Paula Michaels, in terms of her biography, she's an academic historian, senior lecturer at Monash University in Melbourne, and has been fairly widely published. Only 2 books that I know of, but a range of articles, essays, and so on top of that. So she is publishing historian, but also as a senior lecturer, that suggests that she does a lot of teaching history as well at university. So her personal research interests, she suggests, are the Soviet Union, medicine, and gender. And indeed, her books kind of cover that stuff fairly obviously. We'll have a look at one quick example in a second. The book from 2014 that she wrote was actually shortlisted for the New South Wales Premier's History Prize. So she is not necessarily, a big award-winning historian or anything, but she's certainly an established scholar and teacher of history in Australia. So that's her basic background. The book that I was talking about that was shortlisted for this prize is called Lamar's. I don't exactly know how to pronounce that, but basically it's an interesting story because what it is as I understand, I haven't read the book, but it is, from what I've read about it, it follows the history of a particular childbirthing technique that was developed in Eastern Europe during the Soviet Union and actually spread around the world. So it's a sort of an interesting, quirky history, really, of something, cultural history, really, and social history is obviously its emphasis, but also the idea of its international focus. So she's interested in big themes and as well as very specific themes as well. And this will come up a bit later on when she begins to make some claims about the nature of history and so on. So it's just an interesting example anyway of what she is actually doing as an academic. In terms of placing this essay that we're about to have a look at in its context, I think it's important to really emphasize this issue of academic and popular history. And it's not just that issue of academic and popular history. So, but I think that's the big theme here. So one of the big issues around this idea is that non-academics are basically often the best-selling history authors in Australia. And that's raised a lot of questions. Why is that the case? What is it that they're doing that historians aren't doing, perhaps, that is causing them to be best-selling authors? Is that a reflective of a problem of historians, or is it reflective of something else? This is part of the debate. In an article in The Age newspaper in March 2014, Paul Ham, actually, who is one of these popular historians who is basically a journalist by training, has written several books, one on the Australia and the Vietnam War, one on the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one on the Kokoda campaign, World War II. A little bit like Peter Fitzsimons. People often talk about him as a little bit more intellectual than Peter Fitzsimons, though. But he came out in March 2014 and criticised academic historians basically for being kind of irrelevant. They've sort of worked themselves into the ivory tower. And he was essentially defending his, defending, I think in this context, it was his book called 1914, written about the opening phase of World War I and the causes of World War I. And I think and it was a popular book and so on, and he was defending it as to why it was popular, and in the process criticised academic historians. It has this debate about academic and popular history has very strong overtones of the issues connected to the democratization of history, and I think a secondary point of that is the role of the historian in a democratized kind of social context, where you have history being produced and consumed by a huge range of people. What place and role does a historian play in all of this? That raises big questions about that. And I think probably added to the role of the historian are big questions about things like historical authority. Who owns the past? Who should own the past? And big questions like that come up with this. If it's the case that best-selling authors aren't historians, it seems that most historical authority might actually be transferred over to these public authors. When we say historical authority, we mean here the ability to kind of dominate or influence a debate. So that raises big questions, this idea. Are academic historians doing something wrong, is a question. And she says this directly in the essay. She says the latest, Paul Ham's article was the latest in what she calls a steady stream of attacks, castigating or criticizing historians and other scholars for their inability to engage the general public effectively. That was the essence of Paul Ham's argument in her view. And so she came out and wrote this in The Conversation, which is a kind of an online publication in Australia that basically gets experts often to comment on some aspect of contemporary society and contemporary debate. And the essay title is What is Academic History For?, published in March 2014. So, a month after Paul Ham had come out and said that. It's very worth a read. If you just Google the title and maybe even plug in The Conversation or Paula Michaels, you'll get the article very quickly, and it is incredibly brief. But I think in the process of being brief, it actually has a few very interesting claims. What can we deduce about what Paula Michaels argues in terms of the aims and purposes of history? Well, in her view, I think one of the things is that she defends academic history as a valuable thing. So she defends, say, one of the aims of history as being a thoroughly academic enterprise, and she says this is not a waste of time. In contrast to people who criticize academics for writing these obscure books that are very technical and very complicated and sometimes very large and therefore don't sell well, she says actually that has a place in historical scholarship. We don't have to give up that as one of the purposes of history just because those books don't sell well. So that's one of her aims, I think, in the article, and in general as a historian it seems that that's her aim. She's going to continue publishing academic works. Also, I think as part of her aim is to challenge the notion that a historian's role is fundamentally to be popular, that a historian should aim to actually make their work and every work they write be a popular history, or a history that's widely read or consumed, right? I think what she's trying to do is challenge that notion and suggest that there's actually a more complex view here, that history has to be seen in a more complex manner. And this is why I think it's actually a really useful article, because it can tap into a whole range of debates. Thirdly, I think she's trying to challenge the fundamental distinction between academic and popular history. What she's, I think, trying to do as well here is to say that, yeah, okay, there are some clear examples of academic history, there are some clear examples of popular history, but they actually have a relationship often. And we'll have a look at an example in a minute, but she actually points out some writers who actually use academic history in the process of creating very popular works. And her point is that it's not an absolute distinction between the two. What she's saying is that they actually relate to each other and overlap in important ways, and it's not just one or the other. And finally, I think she's aiming to actually claim that historians do engage with people beyond the academy, that it's actually a misreading of academic historians that they sit in a library or a research institute somewhere and never actually try to connect and engage with the public. She says that that's actually just a misunderstanding of what many historians are actually doing. And it's interesting, the article itself in The Conversation might be an example of what she's actually trying to suggest here. She's writing in a popular context about this issue of history. She's an academic, but she's operating in this case in a very public and popular kind of way. So that might actually in and of itself demonstrate that, say, Paul Ham has perhaps been a bit off the mark in claiming these sorts of things. So let's have a quick look at a couple of the main claims and ideas that she brings up in the essay. And these are just not the only things that I think are really important, but some of the most important. One of the claims she makes is that the path of popular history is closed to most academic historians because of the very subjects of their investigation. And she's here challenging this idea that, Paul Ham might say that they're ineffective writers or communicators. She's saying, well, that might be the case, but it's also often the case just simply because the subjects that they actually study as academic historians aren't popular. That doesn't matter. She doesn't really care about that. No amount of finesse, she says, with the written word would have put my first book on the history of medicine and public health in Soviet Kazakhstan on the shelves of Dimick's. So in other words, I could have written that book in any way. She's saying I could have written that book in any way I wanted, and probably it's not going to become a bestseller because not many people probably want to read about the public health policies of Soviet Kazakhstan, right? So it's not going to wind up in a popular bookstore like Dimick's bookstore. The publishing of popular history is driven, she adds to this, not by how scholars write, but by what readers are willing to buy. So she actually sort of turns the table here a little bit and says, it's not just about your ability to write, Paul Ham, a clear writer or whatever, she might concede that, but the fact that you're writing things that people want to consume, books about Kokoda, books about the outbreak of World War I, books about the dropping of the atomic bombs, books about Australia in the Vietnam War. She's suggesting that you're tapping into a market and therefore increasing your sales. That doesn't mean your history is better written, and it doesn't mean it's better history. It's actually an economic argument she's suggesting for your popularity. So she's suggesting that, I think this is how I read it, she's suggesting that it's not the case that historians are bad writers, it's just that sometimes their work is so particular that it may not reach a public audience, and she's not particularly worried about that, it seems. Another claim that she makes is important is that scholarly studies, though often narrowly conceived, nonetheless inform the work of those engaged in topics of broader interest. Now, this is an important point where she's blurring the boundaries of academic and popular history, saying there's actually a relationship between the two often. Not always, but often. Now, the example she uses is a lady called Doris Kearns Goodwin, who I don't pretend to know a lot about, but what she suggests in the article is that this is a historian, or a popular historian, popular writer, you may say, about who writes primarily about US presidential issues. Now, what she's saying here is that Kearns Goodwin, she certainly looks at some things in terms of primary sources, and she does some research as a kind of scholar, but she's not necessarily an academic historian in the way that perhaps Paula Michaels is, right? But the important point that she makes here is that what she does as an engaging communicator, right, is she draws on many academic works of those presidential issues to inform what she eventually says. So where is she drawing her inspiration and her information? From academics. At least that's the argument that Paula Michaels is suggesting here, that here is a popular writer who is openly claiming to draw on the work of academic historians, and what she's doing is perhaps to some degree you could think of it as translating that academic work into a more popular narrative that can be consumed by a wider range of people. And perhaps to put it this way more emphatically, it's as though Michaels is suggesting that Doris Kearns Goodwin couldn't actually do her popular writing without the foundational work of academic historians. So there's a fundamental connection often between popular writers and academic historians. Hence, she's defending this work of academics as a valuable contribution to the wider historical community. The last thing I want to quickly say here about her key claims, last couple of things. So she suggests as well that through their work in classrooms, academic historians often translate and interpret scholarly writings for and alongside students. So that's another thing that they do. They don't just sit and write books, they actually help students understand big academic works. So they're involved in that community on that level. But she goes beyond that and says they are also out in the wider community, beyond universities, sharing their expertise in public talks designed for general audiences. They operate in museums, at schools, in retirement communities, and a whole range of other places. So she's saying, actually, Paul Ham, to suggest that academics are just stuck in ivory towers is a fundamental misunderstanding of what many academics do. Many academics, in her view, are actually engaged in the public. They're not just writing obscure works of history. Final thing that I want to quickly draw out from the essay in terms of her claims is that she suggests that there seems to be ample room for and value in a wide range of intellectual activity. And here she's talking about history, a wide range of intellectual historical activity. So she's not saying you have to just go out and either write popular history or academic history. You can do a range of things. Historians can do whatever they want. And this is actually a good thing. And she carries on here and says, perhaps it's time to set aside potshots, so just, uninformed accusations, and straw men, so straw men arguments, so suggesting something's the case when it's not actually the case. So perhaps it's time to set aside potshots and straw men and recognize that the changing terrain of public engagement allows for, and this is, I think, the critical thing, a multiplicity of voices and forms of expression. She's saying, I'm not criticizing Paul Ham for writing his popular history. He shouldn't criticize me for writing my academic history. There is a place for all of us in producing and constructing histories in this modern space. So that's, I think, the main concluding point that she brings up. So in terms of evaluating the source, evaluating Paula Michaels' essay, I think it's good evidence of the changing nature of history. People grappling with democratization, what some might perceive as the crisis of history, that people have challenged the authority of historians and so on, that there might be some sort of concern that history is being downgraded and so on. This essay is a good example of how this works out sometimes into the public media. I think also it's important to point out that Paula Michaels is not arguing against popular history. She is not saying actually popular history is bad, only academic history should be done. She actually points out in the example of Doris Kearns Goodwin that there are good examples of popular history. What she's saying is that history can and should be done in a variety of ways. And that's an interesting point. That the role of the historian, I've emphasized this in other videos, but is maybe, as Jay Winter, the American historian, says about historians' contribution to our understanding of World War I, that historians are really fellow travelers on this journey to understand what World War I is about. But maybe you could apply that to everything. That historians, when we think about history, historians are just one unique group contributing to our understanding of the past. Don't get rid of them. Don't get rid of the popular writers. It's a social conversation, and we need everyone's voice. Thirdly, I think it's important to perhaps, I think anyway when I read this, is that I think it's a good example of the claims. The essay itself is a good example of the claims that she makes. So she is writing for The Conversation, which is a popular platform, and therefore she as an academic is showing that she's willing to contribute to these social conversations about history. She's not stuck in an ivory tower. She's happy to write books. She's happy to also write articles that perhaps don't even make much money at all. So she's happy to be in the community, teaching at a university, publishing books, writing essays on The Conversation and other websites. If you look at her biography, you'll see that, if you do some Googling about her, you'll see that she writes on a number of platforms. So she is an example of someone who's an academic, but not only an academic, someone who wants to be part of the debate. How does this apply to history extension? Where could you see it coming relevant? Well, I think there's a number of ways. For example, if you're discussing the idea of the changing role of the construction of history, I think this is important because she's arguing that there's a place for academic and popular history. It doesn't have to be binary opposites. That the construction of history has been democratized, and she doesn't see it as a bad thing, but she doesn't also see that academics need to be removed from the picture. Secondly, if you're discussing a question revolving around the aims and purposes of history, well, she's challenging the idea that history's main aim is to gain, some sort of popular following, that historians, that shouldn't actually be their main aim. I mean, it can be if you want, she doesn't mind, but it doesn't have to be the aim of all historians, I think is what she's getting at. So the aims and purposes of history, in her view, are more complex than whether your book sells a lot. So you're not aiming to be, popular necessarily. She would argue something more, I think, along the lines of aiming to do a variety of things. Historians should be aiming to create important academic works, but other historians might aim to create more popular works, and that's okay. So her argument is that the aims and purposes of history is more than just one thing, and I think that's a powerful idea that could be used in essays. And if you're asked to write about the role of the historians, or you're grappling with that, I think this essay is a good example of the idea that historians can, and maybe some should, be publicly active, okay, but it's not a rule. So again, what she's saying is something more complex and subtle, that historians, I think she's suggesting, they certainly can be involved in the public. I think she's even suggesting that some of them should be. She's also suggesting that many of them actually already are, okay, publicly active, but she's suggesting that it doesn't have to be a rule. It's okay for academic historians to actually remain academic historians if that's their primary interest, because that's a valuable contribution. It's okay for someone like her to be an academic historian who also operates in the public sphere. And it's also okay for someone to perhaps be a writer or a popular author or presenter or something like that on TV who doesn't actually do much academic history. That's not necessarily a problem either. It's the idea of having multiple voices on history that is important in her view. And I think there's lots there you could use this essay for. So go and have a look at it. Conversation, Paula Michaels. It's not that long a read, and it might contribute a few ideas for you as you prepare for history extension exam.